The day of the match, the boy sits at rest on a stool at a distance. With the camera cocked and focused in his lap, the woman sits in a cafe chair, restless, staring out over the chessboard, turning her head to one side or the other, occasionally shifting her position, less occasionally standing to walk around the board or lean over to study one of her grotesques. After several circuits, she might sit in the opposite chair and stare again. She might reach out and make an adjustment to one piece or another. If she sees an imperfection, she might, with a thumbnail, scrape away an offending chip of plaster from a skull or a fist. For breakfast, she has taken a roll dipped in coffee and milk. That morning, the boy brings the coffee up to the citadel in a thick bowl, covered in a napkin to keep in the heat. The roll is one of two the boy carries in his jacket pocket, wrapped in another napkin. Most days, except for the festive ones, that breakfast will be her only meal until dinner. Most days, between breakfast and dinner, she will eat only the second roll with water. She drinks that sparingly. Most days, she occupies herself in her industry. That day, there is no industry. That day, the game is simply to wait. And while they sit in the morning sun and wait with the others for their guest, the boy watches a snake eagle circle idly in the sky overhead. In the end, everyone in the asylum is only sure of two things. No one knows why she came. No one knows why she stays. Saying that of that place, I may not be saying anything very remarkable. And it will not be remarkable when one day she dissolves back into the world she comes out of, dissolves silently like blood spilled in the driving rain. But for now, I'm telling you this story, how 7 people meet on a summer day in 1929 in a ruined chapel on a hilltop in the silver sunlight outside of Avignon to play a game of chess. The story of how it all goes so badly, that story is harder to tell. That's the very short first chapter of a book called A Game of Chess, the book I've been working on over the last 6 years now. It's a long time because in the end it's a long book, probably too long with a lot of moving parts and too much geography. In what might be the 45th chapter of part 2, the narrator, who is not me but nevertheless me, confesses to the origins of the story and to its general structure. Game of Chess is a story of lost work and the questions that arise around that. And loss is like a little death and the problem of poetics. There are 3 narrators to this story. It begins in 2012 when I travel to New York and walk uptown to see John Sarkovsky's photographs. On the way, I stop in front of a hoarding and find 2 street people playing chess. They impress me. At the museum, not only see Sarkovsky's pictures, but I see work from the McKay brothers, who build puppetry to make movies out of junk. Over lunch, I sit down and make a kind of resolution. The resolution is simple. I don't want to sit at a computer for the next few years. And in order to do that, I have to make another kind of plan. And what I plan in that hour's lunch becomes a project that is probably, in some sense, happily out of control. The book is about a chess game. It's a story of war and art, and drawings and notebooks, sculptures, a room, 2 actors, various extras, a novel, a performance, photographs, and a film. The thing I'm shocked at is, first of all, how close I've kept to the plan, and how large it's got. The sculptures are 90% finished. The book is 135,000 words in, and when the sculpture's finished, then the book will actually complete itself, not in words, but in photographs. And that's the trick. That is actually my sort of problem. Now, as I said, it's a story of lost work. And that sense of loss is a kind of poetic for me. There are three fictional narrators. The first one is Richard, someone who witnesses that chess game in 1925. He's unreliable, he's an alcoholic, he's a thief, he's a mercenary, and he's a photographer. And he is a relentless witness. Then there's the sculptor, a woman who comes out of trouble, won't or can't speak, whose only name is Lesser Casey, a name for the world she comes from. And she leaves behind only notebooks, collages, and plasters. Her fantasy is, in some sense, to escape her own exiles and her own flights. The third narrator is not me, but me. Now, I'm uncomfortable making things up, so it's very hard to write fiction. So I borrowed a lot of people. I borrowed George Capa from George Orwell, and a real person, a famous subversive, a hero, a spy, and an adventurer. I borrowed Camille Claudel, the sculptor who is incarcerated by her brother in her late youth or early middle age for 40 years and forbidden to work because her work is said to be her madness. This is her portrait by Rodin. Vladimir Mayakovsky is or is not a figure in this chess game. He appears in France in 1928 and fathers children there. Bernice Abbott, who is one of the most remarkable figures of her time, is the person who actually preserves 8 photographs of that chess game. Bernice Abbott was, by the time this chess game was played, the most celebrated portrait photographer in France, a self-educated poor American who arrived in Paris and made her way and then returned to America. Paris plays a large part in the story, but not all by any means, because Paris is a place everyone keeps passing through rather than resting in. And this is a Paris of pictures. This is a Paris of visions. This is Bernice Abbott, photographs taken by the surrealist Man Ray, who was her initial employer in Paris. She came to Paris to be a sculptor. Her first sculptures were actually produced in Greenwich Village. She made them for Marcel Duchamp. She arrived in Paris, penniless, eager to do anything, and became first Man Ray's assistant, and then the most celebrated portrait photographer in France within a very short period of time. Any picture you ever see of James Joyce is very likely by Bernice Abbott. He sat for her several times, brought his family around, and enjoyed more. This is her portrait of Eugene Aceh. Eugene Aceh is a man who dedicated almost 40 years of his life to documenting the entire fabric of the city of Paris. This is Bernice in her grown-up clothes. Bernice was notoriously eccentric in almost every way, including her garments, which were for the most part raggedy and tomboyish. But as she emerges into society, she does well. Bernice Abbott gives this book its title indirectly. At her first exhibit of her photographs, her portraits, and a sculptor as well, because she was initially a sculptor, Jean Cocteau writes a poem for Abbott wears a name, half shade, half light, Bernice. She exposes her delicious memory. She is the site of a game of chess between light and shadow. Bird wings, island birds, Bernice, genderless fowler, tames bird shadows. It is a lucky coincidence. Bernice has been in play in this book from the beginning, in a minor role, but as a kind of catalyst. The book goes all over the place. That's its timeline, 1900 to the present. It involves 3 blocks of story, one happening in the 20s to the 40s, one happening in the early 70s in Toronto, and the last happening probably mostly in Hudson, New York, and in Paris. So it is complicated. Its geography is equally complicated. In some sense, it begins in the town of Tiflis, now known as Tbilisi, that has found itself in Georgia, moves to Moscow, moves to Leningrad, moves to Berlin, moves to Paris, moves to the south of France, and then finally to Berlin. It starts again outside of Warsaw, moves to Lodz, moves to Gdansk or Danzig, moves to Le Havre and to Paris, and again to the south of France, and then splatters all over every field of war in the Second World War, moves itself in turn to Toronto. The third set of circuits begin in Winnipeg, move to Rochester, roll over to New York, go to Toronto, end up in Ames, Iowa, and finally conclude in Hudson, New York, on the way to Paris. So it's a very curious geography that covers far too much territory. One of the people inside that story, very, very, very briefly, is a woman who was born Goethe Tarot. She's known as Goethe Tarot. She's a romantic figure. She is a German Jew who was jailed in 1932 at a tender age by the Nazis for spreading seditious literature. That seditious literature got her in jail, but she got out. She went to Paris, where in time she met Andre Friedman, whose chief claim to fame at that point had been that he had actually photographed Trotsky in Denmark in 1932, giving a lecture. Together, they met in 1935, and together they forged a kind of forgery. They both wanted to operate as journalists or writers, but they also understood that photojournalism made some sense. And so they said, well, nobody here wants to hire Germans now. 1932, the French borders are starting to become less penetrable. The American crash has actually begun to affect the French by 1932. So they determined to make up a prosperous American photographer. And this prosperous American photographer would have a prosperous American name. And they look around for names, and they decide that it should be a name like Frank Capra, the famous American film director. And so they make up Robert Capa. And in time, Andre Friedman becomes Robert Capa, one of the most famous sort of war documentarists and photographers of the last century. He goes on to, in some sense, not entirely alone, but with several other people, change the face and the relationship of photography to words, and most especially to words. Goethe Tarot, whose name is Goethe Polanyi at the time, decides she too should be a photographer, picks up a camera, and they, together with a third friend, David Schwimmer, a Pole who is a Polish student in Paris who decides that photography is just the thing. They travel into Spain to the Spanish Civil War and begin to document it on the side of the loyalists, that is to say the socialists, the communists, the syndicalists, the anarchists, against the fascists, the sort of fascist counter-revolution. Goethe Tarot makes a remarkable name for herself as a documentarist of the life behind the lines. And so while she is actually at war, she is often is not showing how that war affects families, women, and children. in summer of 1937, fleeing in a retreat, riding on the running board of a car, she falls off into the path of a tank, and she's mashed. She lives for a day. She is nursed in the English hospital, and the last person with her is apparently a Canadian whose name is Ted Allen, who is not born Ted Allen. He is a Canadian who took another Jewish player in this game. His name is Alan Herman, until he went undercover to expose sort of the fascist underworld of Montreal, and decided to keep that name forever. If people my age can actually remember Ted Allen, they will remember him as the man who picked up an Academy Award for the script for The Lies My Father Told Me. So he in fact lives a kind of remarkable life, and once again in this story plays a small catalytic part. But this brings us to the moment. October 4th, 2015, passing the day with my daughter, first of all at the Louvre to visit the Nike, and because the selfie crowds with the sort of selfie sticks so overwhelmed us, we decided to go on and track down Goethe Tarot's tomb. Goethe Tarot's tomb fascinated me from the day I looked it up. She was buried in August, and she was buried in an enormous funeral, great celebration by the Communist Party. And she was buried in what is sometimes known as the Eastern Cemetery in Paris, but is more commonly known as Père Lachaise Cemetery. It is sometimes even known as Mount Louis, because the three large cemeteries at the edge of Paris are all actually on rises of land. We took a little while to find her. My instincts on Père Lachaise were entirely fresh, but we did indeed track it down. The tomb is by Alberto Giacometti. Consists of three parts: a chalice, a dove, and a cube on the plinth, which is her tomb. It's actually extraordinarily severe and quite beautiful. The motifs he's used in the past in different combinations for the tomb of his father. I wanted to see it because I wanted to understand why it had been so defaced and what had happened to it. We began to, in some sense, solve the mystery, but at the same time, I found Père Lachaise Cemetery and found an environment that shocked me beyond any simple understanding. Not shocked as in it was spectacular or unconventional, but that its insistent quality, its character fascinated me. On my way out of the cemetery, I had a pocket camera, a small Leica that I sort of carried with me all the time. I took 172 photographs. These very quickly are 90 of them. They're converted right out of the sort of the raw film very quickly in one step. Now, for me, Père Lachaise was a remarkable intersection through the pieces that I went through. And I understand now that we were in some sense spectacularly lucky in the terrain that we chose to walk through. A sort of an intersection of topography, of overgrowth, of monuments, sometimes bizarre, sometimes simply generic. They consist of three types. They're basically these little houses, which are sepulchres where you can step in to pray, and they are over the family plot, the family burial. And sometimes, I understand from my reading, there can be as many as 12 family members stacked down that hole. The sepulchres are one type. Then there are the tombs, usually with either a stone or in some cases a monument. In some cases, these things get wildly out of control. My walk through the place, our walk through it, was actually not particularly, didn't meet the excesses of these monuments. The excessive monuments lay elsewhere. What it met was the sort of the generic monuments, and we were walking through the oldest part of the place. Now, that, in some sense, leads me to the problem of what to make of this place, and led me to a simple resolution. Are you all right, dear? That's fascinating. Are you okay now? I'm sure they're not. Okay. It also led me almost immediately to the sense that I had to go back better prepared to photograph this place, but that I wanted, first and foremost, to photograph it. I didn't want to read about it. I didn't want to map it. I didn't want to survey it. I didn't want to chart it. I didn't want to engage in a morphological study of it. I actually wanted to figure out what it was about this place that so thoroughly got underneath my skin. And that seemed to me to be something in the first instance about what I saw. Now, after a while, what you see is bound to lead you to the question of what's going on here. But in the first instance, what I wanted to do was figure out how to see it and to take a record of that. It took a year and a half before I could actually, almost 2 years, before I could actually get back to that. And those are the images that you see on that side from one day. And that's a very small selection of those images. As my erstwhile printer says, it takes about 200 photographs to get an image you want to keep. And I think in that he's probably about right. So far I've taken 13,000, and I think, for instance, in this one day, there are probably 4 images that are really deep and worth savoring. At any rate, we have this place, and it does deserve some explanation, which is the tricky part with words. Now, looking for answers, I started to go to advisors anyway. And the first one was Michel Foucault. This is from his notorious little essay, Of Other Spaces, Heterotopias, and it will take a bit of reading. The cemetery is certainly a place unlike ordinary cultural space. It is a space that is, however, connected with all sites of the city, state, or society, or village, since each individual, each family has relatives in the cemetery. In Western culture, the cemetery has practically always existed, but it has undergone important changes. Until the end of the 18th century, the cemetery was placed at the heart of the city, next to the church. In it, there was a hierarchy of possible tombs. There was the charnel house, in which bodies lost the last traces of individuality. There were the few individual tombs, and there were the tombs inside the church. Those later tombs were themselves 2 types, either simple tombstones with an inscription, or mausoleums with statues. The cemetery, housed inside the sacred space of the church, has taken on quite a different cast in modern civilizations. And curiously, it is in a time when civilization has become aesthetic, as one says very crudely, that Western culture has established what is termed the cult of the dead. Basically, it was quite natural that in a time of real belief in the resurrection of bodies and the immortality of the soul, overriding importance was not accorded to the body's remains. On the contrary, from the moment when people are no longer sure they have a soul or that the body will regain life, it is perhaps necessary to give much more attention to the dead body, which is ultimately the only trace of our existence in the world and in language. And in any case, it is from the beginning of the 19th century that everyone has a right to his or her own little box for her or his own little personal decay. But on the other hand, It is only from that start of the 19th century that cemeteries begin to be located at the outside border of cities, in correlation with the individualization of death and the bourgeois appropriation of the cemetery. There all arises an obsession with death as an illness. The dead, it is supposed, bring illness to the living, and it is the presence and proximity of the dead right beside the houses, next to the church, almost in the middle of the street. It is this proximity that propagates death itself. This major theme of illness spread by the contagion in the cemeteries persisted until the end of the 18th century, until during the 19th century the shift of cemeteries towards the suburbs was initiated. The cemeteries then came to constitute no longer the sacred and immortal heart of the city, but the other city, where each family possesses its dark resting place. So, Michel Foucault, and in that he's right. The thing to understand almost immediately was in the middle of the 18th century, about 1764, there was a regulation, a ruling passed in the Parliament of Paris. And this is when Paris is part of a royal domain. And that is to say that the cemeteries within the city and related to the churches will be evacuated. They will be sent out, evicted, passed out. And there is some concern and some consternation about what this means. But in general, the idea is that the dead will be disinterred and their bodies will be stored up. This disinterment is one of the ways to understand the catacombs of Paris. Nader in 1864, Nader being the sort of notoriously fabulous portraitist and balloonist of France, leaves off his surveys of the city from the air and instead goes into the underground to document those catacombs, those places where the bodies are left to store up. They, of course, consisting only of bones. He made 23 plates in 64. Each of those plates took 18 minutes to process. And in the 18 minutes, the figures inside them, the people that appear to be workers, are in fact dummies dressed up like the workers, but it is the real place. So you have now one class of people who are simply the bones left behind, stacked and ordered in places. And that persists today, and it persists at Père Lachaise. That relationship is sort of described by Alphonse Esquerros, in which he says, people in the common grave, the middle class in temporary concessions, the aristocracy of finance in perpetual concessions. The population of cemeteries thus finds itself divided between the dead who own their grave and those who don't, the proletarians and the taxpayers. So you have within France hierarchies of burials. You have burial in a common grave, and after a certain period of time the body is disinterred. It is only bones, and the bones are stored in an ossuary. They may be identified and stored individually as a jar and say, there's Mom, that's where she is. Or they may simply join a common box, and the boxes may be of substance, they may be even rooms or buildings. There is a remarkable building within the cemetery, which is the cemetery's ossuary. Or they will have a plot, and now, Père Lachaise, plots may be taken up for 10, 20, 30 years, or in perpetuity, and they all have different rates. After 10 years, you can renew it, and if they don't, they will unearth the body and remove the monument and take the bones and put them away. Or in time, when the bones get to be too much, they will actually reduce the bones to ashes and store the ashes where they would have stored the bones. So you have this entire hierarchy of sort of putting people away. That also means that there are monuments which are perpetual. And the perpetual monuments are there, they've been endowed, and they're often abandoned, which is one of the things that explains why certain aspects of Père Lachaise are so remarkable, for me at least. Now, late in the 19th century, by late in the 19th century, the cemeteries which are formed on the perimeter of the city have become part of the monuments of the city. So they are, for instance, this sort of diamond at the bottom is Montparnasse Cemetery. And up at the top, that other diamond up there is Montmartre. Down here, this big chunk of green is Père Lachaise. And over here is a tiny little piece, the last bit of green and the pink, which is Passé. Passé is often imagined that it was in the city, but is in fact also outside the city. But it is the aristocrat of cemeteries. So the trick is to understand these cemeteries were all set up outside the initial city walls. The gray zone describes the zone of Paris which is protected against tithes and taxes, or by them. So there is a continuous wall built around the city with 40 or more different gates, and those gates are the control points for collecting taxes on 4 fundamental goods, the most significant of which is salt. All salt in France is taxed, and everyone was compelled to buy salt and so pay part of the tax, and which was a subject of great resentment. But as you can see, we have Montparnasse, Père Lachaise, Montmartre, and Passé. They're all immediately outside the wall. Outside the wall is also, in that zone, a bidonville. It is a world where civil law is very weak, where there are smuggling gangs, there are prostitutions, there are great recreations. Alcohol is cheaper outside the wall than it is inside the wall, so there are places of entertainment, and those places of entertainment are usually centers of prostitution as well. At the same time, there's a kind of monumental architectural quality to all of that. This, for example, is one of those gates, and several still exist in Paris. The Ledoux ones seem to stand up. So this is not a tiny or sort of mediocre activity. Now it's worthwhile putting more of this in context. Père Lachaise is still, in some sense, a little outside of the city, and you can see how these boulevards, for the most part, follow the line of the old wall, just as these ones follow the line of the next wall, the fortifications that were built, which were not entirely dismantled until 1926. But you have here Père Lachaise. It is the largest single green space outside of the Bois de Vincennes, the Bois de Boulogne in Paris, and it is actually a center of recreation. You can't picnic there, you can't walk your dog there, you can't drink there. Nevertheless, it gets 3.5 million visitors a year. And on any given day, there are often crowds. Weekends are simply hopeless. This is the aerial photograph of the cemetery. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit, about its development and its growth, starting with the sense that the stuff where you see all of the trees are the oldest parts. And they are also the parts with the most topography. The stuff where you see very few trees, those places are flat, and they're later. So there's a kind of core. The entire cemetery, which I always want to speak of as if it's a park. So the entire cemetery is about between 105 and 110 acres. I measured it at something over 105 on Google Earth, and other things like Wikipedia say it's 110, and everybody has a different figure. It's in that range. That means that there are probably 70,000 tombs and or monuments in the place. There are apparently between 2 and 3 million internments in the place of various sorts, as ashes, as bones, as temporary, or as permanent monuments or tombs. And many, 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 many of those tombs are in fact stacked. There's a whole family will be there. The initial cemetery is, as I said, the wooded parts. There are 5 additions which finally fill it out by 1850, but in fact most of it is in place by about 1825. The gates are not by the original architect. They came later, about 1817. And if you travel to other cemeteries in France, you'll find these gates are imitated. They are now the model for cemetery gates. Not in every cemetery in France, but in several. They have, including the motifs, including the figures, including the shape, with this kind of bow. Get a better detail. As you can see through this gate and through this doorway, there's a kind of public alley. At the end of it is actually a mausoleum, which is buried into the brow of the hill, and above it, a temple, the chapel, this place. And the chapel is, I love it because it seems to virtually have no windows. It's just a very cool building. But it is a curious piece within this. That alley is, especially on the upper side as it begins to rise up the slope, is a place of great distinctions. There are several presidents buried there, and marshals of the army, and I think Rossini is buried there. It is a place of some great significance. The landscaping is perpetually changing. But as you can see, the sepulchres and monuments are simply more extravagant. This is the doorway to the mausoleum. The doors are locked. I've never been able to go inside. I have no idea how you get inside, and I'm not that worried about negotiating it. But it is actually literally the foundation on which the temple sits, which is a kind of fascinating correlation. The other trick to understand about these churches, or these cemeteries, is they're all secular. That was one of the original problems, was that all of the ground that people were buried on in France was consecrated, and they were being buried in unconsecrated ground, and that was of some great significance because there was now a distinction. These are state or public institutions. They have no relationship to the church. Nevertheless, this chapel exists, as do certain other things. That's looking back down the avenue towards the city through the gates. This is a very unhappy place. The land was bought in 1804, designed and opened for burial. They had one burial that year, a child, but they decided to rebrand it. And they rebranded it by going out and getting the bodies of prominent French citizens and moving them in. So La Fontaine and Molière, two remarkable literary figures of the 17th century. One is the kind of storyteller, a fabulist, and the other is a great playwright, are reburied here ensuite on a rue which was originally called Rue or Chemin Molière, is now Chemin Fontaine and Molière. In 1817, because that wasn't enough, they disinterred the remains of Heloise and Abelard and brought them, and they took the salvaged ruins of a monastery chapel and reconstructed them as a principal attraction. And with that, investments lifted off. It's an entirely different kind of condition. I want to go back. I like this one. This is Bizet. I don't really care about Bizet, but Bizet matters to me a lot in the cemetery because on the first or second day I was there walking about with a tripod and a big camera, a lady came up to me and said, "Do you know where Bizet is?" I said, "I think he's dead." She says, "Yes, but do you know where?" And he said, "No, do you have a map?" He says, "Yes, but I can't find him on the map." I said, "Search me." Maps, the entire cemetery is a scavenger hunt. It's a scavenger hunt for whoever you want to see, and everybody you want to see could be there. They could also be in Montparnasse. In fact, it's sort of sad in some way. Goethe Tarot had to be married at Père Lachaise because she had to be buried facing the Communard's wall, the Mur de Fédérale, which is a monument to the left in Paris, as opposed to across the street from her studio in Montparnasse. But it was much more significant to have this there. The symbolic relationship with this wall, which I'll talk about later, is amazing. But the maps, from the earliest dates, the maps are busy locating celebrities. So whatever survey you've got, it will be covered in celebrities. I like some of these more than others, but I don't actually find the whole package particularly interesting at all, which was what was getting under my skin almost immediately. The postcards are telling because they always very clearly identify single monuments, and you sort of understand why. Some people really spread themselves. This one's kind of amazing. On the other hand, I have no idea who it really belongs to. There is a certain point, with a few exceptions, the gaudier the monument, the less likely we know who it was. This is on the hand Casimir Perrier. I keep thinking, did you invent the water? But he didn't. He's a celebrated minister, but by no means a president. Presidents' tombs are often more modest, with one important exception. This is Marshal Ney's. We have fabulous soldiers. And this is simply one of the most delirious. The Romantic movement has a great time there. Chopin is one of my favorites, and the reason is really simply, first of all, there's always a crowd, so you can always find it. There's always flowers, and they're wonderful. And in a very steep part of the cemetery, the monument was designed with stairs up both sides, so you can actually get into the division, into the block outside, beyond the sort of the paths and alleys. So Chopin becomes, for me, this terrific landmark in the middle of things. Also, a really important indicator. He dies in 1849. Where he's buried is actually really indicative of the development of the cemetery. This is wild because you have here the chapel, and you have next to it the monument to Adele Kerr, who is the first president of the reconstruction of France after the occupation in the war with Prussians. So the Franco-Prussian War, in which the Prussians very simply trounce the French and arrive at the outskirts of Paris, is a traumatic event that's marked inside this cemetery in any number of ways. Adolphe Thiers is the president who orders the garrison of Versailles to enter the city and dismantle the commune, dismantle the spontaneous sort of anarcho-syndicalist community, which has organized itself to say, whatever France surrenders to, we won't. We will remain a city unto itself. And so Thiers is the person who is literally the principal instrument in this sort of localized sort of civil war. Immediately down the slope is my all-time favorite. Again, it's like, why? Because Sergeant Hoff has a wonderful spot. He looks out over the entire prospect of the public alley, and so he is always standing up and proud inside this otherwise silhouetted world of trees and lawns. Sergeant Hoff is an Alsatian plasterer who was drafted into the army and remained there for years and became, during the Franco-Prussian War, a hero for conducting apparently remarkably damaging night raids with small forces, so much though that he completely demoralized the Prussians. Hoff is also one of the members of the garrison of Versailles that reinvades the city and seizes it from the Commune. He's actually wounded at that point. The Prussians, at a certain moment, because he'd been captured for 3 months, and he remained anonymous in his capture because he had been so notorious as a kind of celebrity, an armed celebrity. The Prussians actually framed him as a spy for a period of time, but then he was resuscitated and reconstructed, and he is, among all of these other presidents and marshals and whatever, you have this one sergeant who has this remarkably prominent statue just down the road from his boss, which I always thought was a really good part of the story. Just down the road from them is this, and this begins to be, for me, to be the thing that I like about this place, because the monuments, the sepulchres, whatever, don't really hold up much interest, except once in a while. It's in fact the combination. So this is a combination of different monuments, including this modest but actually fairly touching this monument to sort of Felix Faure, who was another president of the Republic, who lies in recline in his death in this bronze. And now under the trees, there's trees growing up all around this, in the company of all of these other characters who kind of look out over it all. I find the complex fascinating, and I've never been able to photograph it as well as I'd like. This is actually, in some sense, the crucial piece of the narrative because it is the only spontaneous monument within the place. In the last days of the fighting, and as the garrison reclaims the city, the communards of Belleville, which is a working class neighborhood in the east side of Paris, the unfashionable side of Paris, established the cemetery as a citadel, but it's too big for them to defend, and they're overwhelmed. The last 147 survivors are lined up against this wall and shot, assassinated, and then dumped into an open ditch and buried. And this wall has then become sort of the place of martyrdom for the French left. If you're a communist, a socialist, a syndicalist, an anarchist, this is your place. And the avenue facing it is of some great significance, and actually part of the story for why poor Goethe Tarot's tomb is in the last instance defaced. There are others that actually have some sense of combination, which I like. The sense that this is really what the place is obviously this sort of essay is about. Raspail always ends up in this sort of cluster. It's fantastic. And of course, there's also the only other images which actually show the grouping of this thing is the sort of place as it's bombarded. There is, on the east side, a colossal crematorium and columbarium around it. The columbarium is, I guess, sort of library of ashes and bones, boxes that you put people away in. So there's all sorts of famous characters in the walls around this thing. It's kind of amazing in its sort of spectacular weirdness. Don't really mean to do that. This is the man who is the architect of it all. He never saw it really come to fruition. A Boneyard, and I'll never pronounce that properly. He is most known as the architect of the Bourse, the stock market. And the stock market is named after him, so it's Palais Boneyard. He produces this plan. Now, this plan is dated 1813, which means I'm only slightly puzzled, but it shows most of the principal elements. That is to say, the gate in some form, the alley divided in two, the temple or chapel, one monument up there intended to be something, a monument over there on access to the chapel intended for something, and something way up there, and a walk through it. As you can see from the shading, there is some real acknowledgement that there is an escarpment right within this place. Other maps later show that escarpment with more confidence, this one being my favorite. But as you can see, what happens is on one hand you have a record of the topography, and on the other hand you simply have a record of everybody who's buried there. So the sense of this being a kind of archive of bodies is actually kind of crucial, and it's actually one of the ways that you have to look at it to understand it. The sort of sense of the archive of important people buried there goes on and on and on in various expressions. The other thing that's important to point out right now is north is that way. Conventionally, most of us will draw a map with north up. Every map drawn in Paris draws this thing with the gate at the bottom, at the front door, facing in some sense into the city. And that seems to be crucial. So you'll find virtually no map, in spite of the fact that there's a gate at the top, which is equally as popular as the one at the bottom. The one at the bottom is the appropriate address and is the one that faces to the city. This is, I've added the red, but this is someone's map, I can remember who some other day, that shows basically the original plan, more or less in red, and the additions. And I would call this one basically the sort of southern annex, which actually is in two parts. There's a sort of an inner part and then an extra part. There is the northern annex, or the northwestern annex, and the eastern annex, which is this huge piece. Here you see what the old fabric was, and you can see, if you look carefully, a broken line for the avenue that's created. Once they create this avenue, these buildings are all gone, and this strange bow-shaped piece of land becomes Parc Samuel de Champlain. So it becomes a public park immediately on the edge of the cemetery. That illustrates it without exactly committing itself to the significance of the topography. And again, map after map. There are books published that index these things. There are huge books. You can find almost no text on the cemetery that does anything other than give you a page by page by page by page by page by page directory of who everyone is and where they're buried. They come with a map and you go through. It doesn't matter, German, Italian, French, it's the same game. There is very little looking at the place in and of itself. There's also, at these stages of the thing, some distinction in the different kinds of avenues and paths. Those distinctions get erased over time. But here we have the beginning of something interesting, which is, that's the chapel, and there's a little red block next to it, and that is meant to have been matched by one on the other side in other plans, but it never happened. So you have this one monument, the most prominent monument in the cemetery, to the president who, in some sense, helped evict the Prussians a couple of years early. This is, for me, the most dependable map. It's from about 1904. And it's the one that shows most closely what the recorded spaces are. And it's interesting to understand that up there, almost nothing has changed, although things are more developed. Down here, these streets and paths have all been highly rationalized, presumably so that you can actually get a hearse in and out of them. It's still an active cemetery. I like this map because it is somebody's explanation of how to do a tour. And as you can see, it tends to avoid the eastern annex and the northwestern annex and the southernmost annex in favor of the core site, along with a few special moments. But it concentrates in that core. There's a reason. This is the only map I've come across outside of modern times in which north is actually up on the page. It was engraved and produced in Germany. Obviously, they don't feel the same way about the center of Paris. This is not a current, but a sort of historic tourist map. And this is like one of those diagrams of like where the bullet holes are in the plains. If you look at the brown spots, you kind of go, what are they? They're celebrated people. That's all they are. They're just, these are all celebrities. And as you can see, they're entirely clustered in the old parts. There's a smattering up at the far eastern side and a whole pile facing the Mur de Fédéré, the Communard's wall. But for the most part, things are fairly short on celebrities. That is to say, most of the cemetery is, in fact, a middle-class enterprise. And so the question, of course, then was to say, why? How does this work? So one exercise really quickly was to say, how did the French do this? Well, one of the things to look at is the French arrondissement, which turned out to be numbered in a spiral, who'd have thunk? Not in any kind of grid, not in any kind of inner ring, outer ring, but actually in this coiled spiral that ends with the end. So you think, okay, there is now the numeration of these divisions, which actually seems important. There may be something indicative in it. So there's a moment of saying, let's take a look. This is 1, 2, 3, and 4. What's interesting about 4 is that it's actually on either side of an alley, so it actually deliberately conceives of a space. Most of them don't. But some of them obviously were created too. 5 and 6 is sort of next, and you think, why is that there? You say, that was Heloise and Abelard. Those divisions were developed next. And then, obviously, infilled in between. Within the place, there are certain interesting corners. This cluster is actually known as the sort of for the Israelites, and number 85 is for the Muslims. So in this secular domain, there is still that distinction made, although there are Jewish and Muslim people buried throughout the place. What happens now is we're starting to work up the hill, but as you can see, when these things are enumerated, they're actually intent on creating the streets on either side of them. So 16 and 17 are opened up probably at the same time and create part of that chemin. And they get different names as things go on, much like anything else. But all we're doing is working our way up the ridge, and finally you break through. These ones are a bit funny because what's very clear is that 44, 42, and 41 were only half the size originally and then were expanded into new purchases, rationalized to go with the next pieces. This is the last completion of the old territory, or the original territory. And you've got the northwest annex. And this, which is a separate and distinct thing, begins with the acquisition of these properties, but then becomes a plan for finishing the walls and the spaces all around them. And then you finally get that area that I end up just thinking of as like Sunstroke City, which is the Eastern Annex. These are my names for these things that they seem to work. Now, I want to sort of skip this in some sense, except to talk for a few moments about it. But the problem of syntax being, in some sense, the problem of what lies between things or what organizes things rather than the things themselves. So in a chess set, you always understand that these pieces are given particular significance. They're named a king, a queen, a bishop, a knight, a rook, a pawn. There is a compelling thesis that chess spread so rapidly because, among other things, it taught people the management of life at court, and it taught people political life, so that it was in fact a kind of an educational tool, so that the representative nature of pieces, which changes from culture to culture, so the Chinese manage it in a different way than the Indians, than the Persians, or the Europeans, but in the same system of kind of feudal hierarchy. So its popularity as a social instrument that refers outside of the game is at least as significant as the problem of the game itself. That's challenged in an interesting way in 1924 when a man named Joseph Hardwick designs a chess set at the Bauhaus that is intended to sort of void, apparently intended, what it does is it voids the representation of the chess pieces and in fact makes the chess pieces into representations of their syntax, of their move, so that a rook is foursquare and can only move in those directions, whereas the knight can go up and over, the bishop can only go in the diagonals, the queen can take any direction, the king only limited directions, and so on. So that the piece becomes not a signifier of something outside, but something that actually represents, in some sense, the syntax of the game itself. Now, this is just for fun. This is a famous chess game. It was played in 1935 in Margate between the young challenger, who was a Polish-American, and the reigning champion, an Italian virtuoso. It's a chess game that I'm actually borrowing and adapting for this book, but it also is a nice explanation in some sense of the significance of the syntax. The symbolic notion of the parts is there, obviously, rook, bishop, king, knight, queen. But what really matters in some sense is the movement across the board. There's apparently those people who calculate such things say if you played all the chess games in the world, you would outstrip time. So that syntax, which is, in an 8x8 matrix with only a certain number of figures, 32 pieces altogether, is apparently near infinite in its capacity. So that for me is kind of engaging. Syntax runs another way for me, and this gets to what gets to me about Père Lachaise. This is one of many, many, many experiments in artistry. Man Ray is one of the artists, Jacques Tanguy is another, I don't remember the rest. It's an exquisite corpse, which was almost immediately the association I had within Père Lachaise. The exquisite corpse is a game that you play. You take a piece of paper, you fold it any number of times, one for each player, and one player draws to the fold, leaves the marks for where their drawing leaves off, and folds it over so it can't be seen. The next player then adds to the drawing, and so on until you complete it. That is to say, no one per se has any idea of what the overall thing is, except to say that we will agree that it's a figure of some sort. And so it then goes from there. For me, the thing which is ultimately fascinating about Père Lachaise is the way in which the combinations are over and over again remarkable and completely incapable of being planned. There are clearly zoning ideas, so that, for instance, the sepulchres, for the most part, line the allées and chemin, and the graves or the tombs are often inside these places, but that's not entirely the case. It is absolutely almost entirely the case in the most modern parts of the cemetery, but not in other parts. Another way of looking at this question of sort of syntax, it is to say, frustrating or accommodating or reinventing the relationship between the parts, or discovering unintended relationship between the parts. Might be in, for instance, the photographic work of Wolfgang Tillmans. Tillmans is interesting because if you Google Wolfgang Tillmans, you will inevitably see installation shots, because what matters most about Tillmans is that no two photographs seem to be particularly very much alike. And so he persistently shatters your expectations for what the next photograph will be, in scale, in subject, in development, in the way it operates, and even how it's framed in cases. So, and these are modest versions of this. I'm going to just skip right through the next one because it takes too long to make that argument. There is inside me, the understanding that, of course, in architecture, syntax has semantic value. And we understand that pretty quickly when we understand that one of the most powerful systems of symbols. It's in fact also a syntactic thing. It is an ordered, it's an organization of components automatically, so that it becomes not simply about a column or a wall or an opening, but about a particular relationship between these parts. So that you can, for instance, see this most explicitly, for instance, in the books of theoretical projects by Durand, which are produced in the same period of time as the cemetery is being invented. So I can't make more of that than that for now, because I think it's another story. But it does mean that it takes me back to my attraction to particular combinations, because it seems to me that in fact they grow in significance and impact and simply in the pleasure that they give by these unexpected combinations of things. Now, we've done these. Or in fact, in the only really discovered monument within the cemetery, which I think is an engaging question. And good old Chopin and Respire. The only documentarist that I can find who seems to have caught on to this right away is Eugene Aceh. And Eugene Aceh, these are 2 pages from his catalogue raisonné. And so you have Eloise and Abelard, but back, including the sort of tombs and plots around it. And you have, again, Respire, which is always this combination of pieces. And you have here, I love that this thing is now completely built up. So this was taken in 1904. So you understand that the place is not nearly as dense as it now is. This is called the Chemin de Chèvre, the goat's path. And it definitely is. It's now paved and finished and terraced and everything else. But it remains sort of some significance. I think the sense, I think I'm grasping at it, but I'm making another point. And it would be this thing where you write on the ground, the Vietnam War Memorial, which I think is one of the most explicit expressions of a kind of syntactical vocabulary. That is to say, this will go into the ground. It will not come out of the ground as a cenotaph. It will go into the ground as a kind of graph. And the graph is actually the lists of the dead, which grow to a certain point and then diminish again. And so you have, in fact, a monument which is generated, in some sense, by the analysis and the averaging of the length of lists of the dead in each year. And the fact that it makes no other representation, but that it has every name in it, which is, of course, the ultimate representation in some sense. You write every name on the ground. It seems to me to be something that actually plays with this question of syntax. Now, like I said, I can't make a lot of this right now. What I want to do is actually bring it home as quickly as possible. This is probably my last expression of that kind of syntactical play. This is a map which is made for people who actually want to visit the significant graves of those communards who survived the commune and are buried at Père Lachaise. So it goes through, and it's interesting that in fact it goes through the Northwest Annex and the Eastern Annex and finds itself nowhere in this place at all, and concludes, of course, with the Communard's Wall, before you then leave the last couple of monuments and take off out the other end. So you arrive by metro at one end and you catch the metro at the other. So it is, to me, it's engaging because what it does is actually treats the cemetery as a kind of syntactic problem now. That you actually say, hey, there's a narrative if I join up all of these points. And of course, what's interesting about the narrative is that it skips 2 parts of the story of the commune. And that would be, in the first instance, the monument to the man who put an end to it, and the monument to its most celebrated, the most celebrated soldier in the army that put an end to it. They are not mentioned on that map, which has struck more than one person as an absurdity. But that's the list. The other thing that's interesting about the list is, for the most part, the dates of their deaths are a decade either side of 1900. And so you begin to understand from that when those portions of place were developed. And of course, that then leads immediately to an understanding in some Borgian sense that, of course, there are maybe 70,000 of these things. They're all written, they all have dates, they all have names. So in fact, almost every square yard of the place is signed. Everything is marked, everything is identified, everything is dated. You know when somebody went into the ground and you know who else is there. There are certain curious parts of this, which is to say, of course, if there's a family plot, it's always identified by dad until very recently. Then you get mom and dad, and it's dad's bust or dad's, relief. Never mom, never the family, which is interesting, but family respi, which is to say, famille respi, which is they're identified. All of this came back to me on one other project, a very old one, which was me tracking the sort of lines that the United States had actually marked as their way of sort of memorializing their territory, all in the last instance retroactively marked by this, which is a zero marker milestone, which is in front of the White House. It's still there. It's about the size of a small refrigerator. And everyone stands on it to take photographs of the White House without looking at it and saying, this is interesting, So you have this, this signature on the ground. This is it. Okay, photographic syntax. All right, we're 20 minutes over. That's rotten. This is, very quickly, the story of a note found in my camera bag. I am attracted to shift lenses on cameras and have been for over 40 years. A shift lens is a lens that takes the forward lenses of the lens assembly and allows you to move them up or down in relationship and so change converging lines so that instead of pointing the camera up, you can actually shift them and it will look up, but it will not make a converging perspective. It's the classic architectural photography tool. I like it because it has this ferocious discipline to it. And this was the note inside the camera bag to remind me when I'm standing in the middle of some place in sort of eastern Colorado and there's nothing for 60 miles and I'm thirsty and tired and I don't want to take this photograph, that I have to do several things or I will screw it up. Verify the film speed, frame the image, anchor the tripod, focus the camera, verify the filter, narrow the aperture, set the time exposure, lock the mirror, close the viewfinder, brace the camera, expose the picture. The camera at this point I'm talking about is a thing, it's about the size of a small cash register, a Pentax medium format 6.7 camera, which I thoroughly enjoyed using for years and of course don't use any longer. But it is a creature where all of those steps are necessary. You could no more handhold this creature than you could handhold a BMW. It simply isn't going to happen. It leads, in some sense, to my argument that in photography, the subject and the light are a very, very small part of the question of the photograph. That the light and the subject are there, but the lens and the aperture, the shutter, the viewfinder, the format of the camera, the chemistry of the film, which is now in fact a different question. It's now the digital operations inside the camera. All of that controls the exposure time, the focus, the depth of field, and what you can take and what you can't take. And in some sense, the framing of the image. The most conscious decisions a photographer makes before taking the photograph is in the choice of the instrument, the settings, but the true decision that the photographer makes is actually decide on the frame. The subject and the light are the subject and the light. You work with them. Where you decide to actually establish the frame inside that and say, that part of all of the world that I'll see, I'm going to wrench out of the world. That is a syntactic question, I think. So we're going to breeze through this because I don't want to get involved too much. Now, we've had machines to draw with for a lot longer than we've had cameras. The problem of the camera, the photographic camera, was well expressed when people said, how do we actually fix the image that we can put on the paper? Because they were able to put images on the paper over and over again, but they would fade within hours or minutes. But they'd say, we can do that. How do we keep it? They understood that because we had any number of different devices. The camera obscura, the camera lucida, all of these are machines to draw with. Going back to Dürer, David Hockney, the British artist, made a very well-established case for the extensive use of these kinds of materials in the Dutch Renaissance and probably even farther back than that. So there's the technology of sort of machine-aided drawing has been there a long time. The distinction that the camera makes is that the drawing resides on either something which receives that image, a piece of film, or a device for taking it in. Whereas in these cases, you in fact have to draw that image into place. Now, once we have that camera in place, and once we have that, we have a different kind of problem. I've included this because this is the most important photograph in Europe, and probably most people don't know about it. The photographer is Eugene Aceh. Aceh is taking a photograph. He never photographs people in crowds and things. This is not his métier, but it is the day of an eclipse, and he photographs this group. Aceh is someone who's known to various surrealists, and Man Ray goes to his studio because Aceh sells photographs. He prepares photographs, and there are catalogs of photographs, and you can go and buy them. Sometimes he will sell a portfolio to the government to document something, but basically he's there as a service. Man Ray goes to his studio. They are fascinated by this guy who gets up every day, goes out with a great big old bellows camera and a big black coat with his pockets full of glass plates and takes photographs day after day. This side of the street, that side of the street, all the buildings down the street, some of the details, and on. And he's done this for 40 years. Before that, he was an actor. It's a commercial enterprise. Man Ray buys these things. He buys this photograph and puts it on the cover of his magazine, Surrealism. And so this image is first of all, it is in fact a surreal image and funny. But it also means that Man Ray's assistant at the time is one young Bernice Abbott. Bernice Abbott likes this old man a lot and visits him regularly. They trade information, they do stuff. She photographs him. And he dies very soon after she's photographed him. They have become friends. She is very attached to him. When she hears he's dead, she rushes to his home, finds his old camera has been sold, but at least 1,500 glass plates and 8,000 prints are still there. She gets her girlfriend. She borrows $10,000 and buys the lot. Washes them, packs them up, brings them to America. She brings them to America. She starts to find ways to exhibit them. She eventually, because she's short of money, sells a share in them to an art dealer by the name of Eugene Levy, who comes to represent Henri Cartier-Bresson. He comes to represent Walker Evans. When Walker Evans sees these photographs, he literally understands what he wants to do. Before then, he's been operating as a kind of sort of dramatic perspective shots and sharp contrasts. He sees these and changes the work. Other people see them and adapt this work, this documentary stuff. Without this picture, that relationship wouldn't have rolled. If those pictures wouldn't have gone to America, you would have no Walker Evans, you would have no Gary Winogrand, you would have no whatever, you'd have no Robert Frank, you'd have no people operating that. They would operate, they would photograph, but they would not have in some sense operated with the syntax of Aceh's photographs in their mind. This is the kind of detail that he would occasionally do. He never looks up at trees, so his photographs of trees are inevitably like roots and trunks. It was in front of me, and that's what I will take. The other thing about these photographs, they're all printed for the most part on albumen paper. Occasionally they are printed on platinum paper, but it's mostly albumen. It's an incredibly sensitive and detailed paper, and the prints are made very easily. What fascinates me about them is that they're not, silver is actually a fairly coarse photographic medium for printing. These Albumin is much more sensitive, and so is platinum. And they do not lie on top of the paper. They virtually lie within the paper, so that they have a much different relationship to the paper. That is to say, the paper is much more participant in the pictures than it is in a classic silver print, the kind of prints that your mom and dad would have, or that I was once printed. You can still print, but hardly at all. But they're remarkably sensitive. What they do not do very well is blacks and whites. What they do is all that stuff in between. Now, one of the things that's very funny, and anyone who goes to Photoshop and says, okay, correct the contrast, will get a perfect replication of Ansel Adams' zone system that says every photograph must have a black at one end and a virtual white at the other, and all of these degrees in between. These prints chop the ends off every time. And this is a thing which I found remarkably admirable, that there was, in the shadows, there were still details. This is, I'm sorry, this is, not the best reproduction, and these are copies of copies of copies. This is Aceh's studio, and you can see the instruments by which they prepare these prints. They're large glass plates. The glass plate is put on the paper. It's shut tight in a frame. The frame's exposed to the sunlight, and the paper gradually develops, and that's that. It's then fixed and stopped, and that's the end of it. They're remarkable, and they're very long-lasting. Platinum prints last forever, but he didn't really much print in platinum because the albumin was a very available paper. Going back degrees to, frankly, a better technical photographer, one of the best, Marvy, who was often sort of photographing for the French government or for the Paris government as records of reconstructions and demolitions. And his photographs are technically superb, usually 11 by 14 plates, and they're stunners. So these, for instance, this photograph, the next, and the next all document the Biver River, which you'd say, what river's that? It's now covered over. It was virtually an open sewer in Paris because all the tanneries organized themselves along it. So it was a great source of industrial pollution, which is presumably something to do with why these documentations were there. But I know it's the projection and the enormous amount of the quality is lost. But as you can see, the range in the sort of the grays and the range in the details is me fascinating. This is the market hall, and all this blur at the bottom are people moving. So it's a very long exposure in weak light, and once again you get this whole sense of these persistent grays. Development and construction. And this one I especially like because it is, that's the same arrondissement that the cemetery is in. So you have to imagine that at a certain point, the domain around the cemetery is this kind of bidonville. Now, if this is one tradition, there's another tradition that's being developed simultaneously, and that's not the tradition of detail and scale, it's the tradition of speed. So you have literally the inspiration, the snapshot is called the snapshot first because it was a gun, a piece of gun diction. A snapshot was a quick shot with thing. The snapshot only becomes the snapshot in photography after it has in some sense imitated the aggression of a gun. This is a camera developed by a French student of movement, and so Eugene Aceh, and he is trying to track movement, which means that he has to, in fact, not sit there in a very long exposure and get the market hall, but in fact get the man running or get the horse running at this. Other versions of this. This is the Thompson camera. In spite of the fact it's called Thompson, it's a Paris gun, which is literally the camera's handgun. Now, you think, how do these traditions meet? Well, they meet in my life in a funny kind of way. I talked about Robert Capa earlier. The most famous photographs of the D-Day landing are Robert Capa's. He went in on the landing with 2 Contax cameras with Leica lenses. And he was prepared for anything. They had to go in another waist. It is recorded because someone else said, this guy with a camera pulled me out, I would have drowned, and he rescued me. So there's a sort of sense of Capa being intensely involved in this. He shoots off 2 rolls of film, refills the films under fire, refills the cameras, and shoots off 2 more. At that point, he's got 4 rolls of film, and his hands are wet, and he's shaking and frozen and frightened, and he decides that he will get these 4 films back to England. So he goes back to the landing craft and says, these have to go to England. And then he says, this isn't going to work. So he gets back on the landing craft and goes back to England, where the film is delivered to the Times of London. And they go into a darkroom assistant, and his job is to develop the film. He's incredibly excited. This is a scoop. These are the first images of the D-Day landing. He has to get them out as fast as possible. He turns up the heat on the film dryer and melts the emulsion on almost all of the film that's been sent. 9, 10, maybe 11 frames survive. That's the most famous photograph of the D-Day landing. It would have been jettisoned, except that, in fact, there was nothing left. This was like, I'm going to do this. It establishes a syntax for combat that hadn't been there before, a syntax for action, which is to say, bad photography becomes good. If you go to a bookstore and say, pick up a book in the D-Day landing, you'll find this photograph. It was without a doubt. It probably made him rich. It's on the cover of Time. It went on and on. It's technically a ruin as a photograph. But if you look at the first 20 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, that is the syntax of that movie. That is to say, it is ripped right out of Capa's 12 frames and turned into cinema. And the same way, bad camera work, shaky, whatever, lost, shot, and the effect is almost everything. My problem at Père Lachaise was to actually figure out how to combine these 2 conditions. I was going to photograph something that I had never exactly tackled before, and I knew only one thing, which was that I wanted to get groups of things in this place. And wherever I saw them, I was going to take them. So I researched for about 1.5 years before I bit the bullet and bought a car and lenses that were, or car and lenses, I bought a camera and lenses that would have also bought me, like a Toyota Corolla. So it's this creature, which is a Hasselblad medium format mirrorless camera with a receiver. It's about that big, and it can be handheld. The fact that I had to handhold it is a different story. At the time, there were 3 lenses available: telephoto, a 45, and a 30. These lovely guys over here, the macro and the ultra wide angle, were not then available. So I go with the 30 millimeter and the 45. The first day I'm there, day 1, I go in with a 45 and a tripod. And the day is a bust. I cannot make this go. And I think, okay, I'm just getting used to this camera. Really rusty. I've had no chance to familiarize myself with it before I got here, work on it. Day 2, it's a little better. Day 2, I get in trouble. Day 2, I'm there. I'm going to photograph the LA. This seems important. I'm there, paying attention to everything. And a woman comes out of the guardhouse and says, in French, "You making a movie?" No, he's taking a photograph. Well, okay. And so I go on, and that's it for that number 2. Then I get to 3. 3's okay. I'm starting to get the gist of this camera and this stuff. But you can see, these are small portions. I'm going home, drawing this in the map and going, what am I going to do? Like, that's a day, right? It's like, whew, nothing. I can't get this done. So 3's there. 4, I'm out there, same out in the public space. Guy comes along and says in French, what are you doing with this tripod? Taking a picture. You're not supposed to have a tripod. What am I going to do? I can do this with a tripod. Look at the camera. He says, no. He says, well, don't let me catch you with it again. And he leaves. Right? That's it. Okay. All right. Keep going, right? So we're up to day 4. We're okay. Day 5. I get up, it's 5A. I get up to the end of 5A. Short, stocky Moroccan woman walks up, uniform, says, nope. Nope. And she waits until I take it all apart, put it in the bag, put it on my shoulder, and go to lunch. And think, if she catches me again, they're going to kick me out of this place because they're kind of strict. So I realized for the rest of the day, I'm living with a tripod, and for the rest of the time, I'm living with a tripod. I stop by, say, where's this rule? No one knows what the rule is, but it's the rule. And there's 2 or 3 weeks where I could apply to use the tripod, but I have no idea who to apply to. And my French sucks. And I think, okay, how are we going to do this? And so I take this reasonably heavy camera, which is advertised as a studio camera or a good landscape camera, but not the kind of camera you take to a football game, and start to work out how it will really be handheld, which means that you strap it on, you find lots of things to lean against. And this becomes, in fact, the most freeing moment of the whole thing. I no longer have to have the tripod. I can go anywhere. I can get involved in anything. I have to take a lot more shots. And the trick is, once again, the syntax of my photographs is really simple. It has to be a low ISO, which means that there's maximum sensitivity, the finest grain. If I take a high ISO, it will be coarse to begin with. I want the greatest depth of field, which means that the camera has to be stopped down quite tight, which means that I'm going to have to figure out how to stabilize the camera because it's going to be very slow exposures. What I end up doing is saying, I will bracket everything 5 times. I will take 3 or 4 or 5 photographs instead of 1, because one of them will not have camera shake. I will struggle to keep it 1/60th of a second and keep that up. What it means is that basically I finally start to make time and start to cover more distance. Now, the enemies in this thing are A, rain, obviously, and B, strong sunlight. Now, at this moment, this stuff gets to be really wild. This is real topography, and the real topography things really start to break down. These are the photographs that you've seen there. Those are the 13s. 14 is actually a reasonably interesting world. And day 15, which is the sunstroke nightmare. It's like there's no shade, there's pure sun, 9 hours at the end of at 4 o'clock. I just found a hose bib and just soaked everything because I thought I'm going to make myself sick. Now, the result is that I have a huge number of exposures to get a small number of final photographs. That is a choice. That is a photograph which I've chosen. It is underexposed in the foreground, but that means that there's a lot of detail in this stuff. And it's properly exposed in the back. The sky is very light, but that's just the nature of the sky there that day. What I will do in the raw file, as I begin to process it, is fill in the shadow so that I get more detail, and damp down the contrast so that the black and white ends of it start to come in a little bit. And then, this is a ghastly image, but you get the idea. I actually select the stuff which is properly exposed and add it to the things which are now brought up. to make a photograph, which you say, well, that's artificial. And you say, it's all artificial. Every photograph is artificial. This is simply a photograph that actually spreads the exposure range in the image. And then I'll begin to convert it. I won't convert it to black and white once. I'll convert it to black and white sometimes 7 or 8, 9 times with different filters so that I can actually find as many different gradients. So that, for instance, that's an exposure where greens are very, very, very light. And then that's one where greens are still reasonably light, but blues are pressed in. That is the default exposure in Photoshop, which is a good exposure in science. What will then happen is that I'll establish different transparencies for these things and work them out. Now, this I prepared in 20 minutes for this talk. The process is really more like about 3 or 4 hours because there's a lot more layers. But now this begins to be a manipulation of those layers as they get built up and different transparencies are worked out. I will also then take what amounts to the levels and find the limits on where the black and whites are, because I really am striving in the last instance for the condition that I found in those remarkable 19th century prints. And then I will crop it. One of the things about Hasselblad is that I can describe any different format to the camera. It's a computer with a lens on the front of it. What I do is pick the very largest format because what I want to do is actually capitalize on the same opportunities that the shift lens offers me, which is to be able to say I can go up or I can come down. Hasselblad makes a shift lens, or they did. They have them in stock. They no longer make them. They also have panoramic lenses in stock. They no longer make them. They will sell me an adapter for my camera, and I'll put these things on. But in brackets, more or less the question is, why would you bother? Because it's all done in the machinery. And I have to accept that, although I'm very tempted to still buy one of their shift lenses and adapt it to the camera. This would be the crop. The reason is really simple. I want to actually start to pursue that kind of panoramic condition because in some sense you step farther into it, and because it's also not the 19th century photograph. It's actually a different kind of condition. And also because, frankly, it appeals to me. So we have, that. And if I do this again with more thought, I'd say this line should be there and there should probably be more trees. But that will be part of the 4-hour process. Panoramas have been dependable documentaries for a long time. This is a very curious one. The turn of the century is Sarajevo documenting its harbor. I particularly like it because it's a wreck. Every day for the last 12 years, I got up and sat down at a desk with this panorama by Larry Towell, which is of Gaza. And the first time I saw it, it broke my heart. It's an amazing picture the frame is over 6 feet, but the picture itself is somewhat smaller. The day I saw it, I was shattered. I just walked into Stephen Bolger's gallery and thought, this is the most intense aesthetic experience I've had in some time. I got it for Christmas. And it was like, what an incredible gift. And have cherished it ever since and study it regularly. The sense the panorama offers is really that sense that there are things that are quite close to you and there are things that are at great depth. And you say, well, that's the same if it's a bigger frame. You say, but it doesn't read the same. It doesn't work the same. But the real truth of it is that I think I learned about panoramas from Sergio Leone. Now, anybody my generation is going to actually remember this movie. There's Once Upon a Time in the West, right? Which Rick Haldenby still shows to students regularly. Sergio Leone is brilliant. The film is written by Bernardo Bertolucci. Leone and Bertolucci thinks he's clever enough to sort it all out. Leone is able to take very long shots and occasionally move it, but action will come in and out of the frame and he will charge the image more likely at the edges than in the center. And that seems to be kind of crucial to the whole enterprise, so that he will have a whole discourse between two people on here, and the center is kind of a void. Things are almost always frontal, and there's an enormous amount to learn inside his compositions about that format. That may be enough to say, except for the last thing, which is that syntax for me also involves not taking pictures of any people. And I will occasionally take pictures of people, but they're not going there. Of the very simple reason that people are really interesting. They're really interesting. And they do unexpected things. So this guy then sort of like, who are you? What are you doing? So you get, it's kind of, there they are. He's just having a great old time, and she's having a wonderful time, and they're just gathering this all up on their phones. And then it's sort of like, who are you? What's this about? They're wildly interesting. They're a whole story. You could just say, hey, I'm just going to go to that place and photograph people, and it would be a completely different kind of narrative. What I want to do is actually learn about these combinations, begin to understand how these things come to be. Now that, in fact, I've run over my time by a lot. I'm sorry. We're going to do one last thing really fast. When I started this, I had to go back to something very quick. And it was this guy. The story is really simple. In 1970, with my girlfriend at the time, I played hooky one afternoon and took the University of Toronto bus out to the Scarborough campus to watch a television interview. They had a television station out there. And Tom Wolfe was being interviewed by, what's her name? The editor of Ms. Somebody help me quick. Nobody? The publisher of Ms. magazine? That's before everybody's time. It was before Ms. magazine. Anyway, they were both bloodied each other and arrived at nothing, but Gloria Steinem, thank you. God, there's at least one person awake in the room still. Thank you. At any rate, it was very unsatisfying, but I went out there with a new friend of mine, a guy by the name of Sam Carter, who was studying landscape architecture at Toronto at the time. And coming back, Sam was alive with reference to this book. So I went out the next day to SCM and bought it for $1. That's the price of enlightenment in 1970. In it, Barthes makes a very complex summary of Saussure's notions of linguistics as they spread into a larger language of signs. And, but he has one thing to say inside all of this, which is to say, words will always trump the other languages. Words will trump the gestures. Words will trump the rituals. Words will trump the paintings or the photographs, because we're such a word-heavy culture. Now, it seems to me, as an architect or someone who wants to take photographs right now, or people who want to make things, that may very well be the case, but that's not your business. Your business is not the words, it's the things. And so in some sense, to say the literacy of that is involved not in saying, these are the words, this is the alibi, that's the explanation, but these are the things. And the things still have to, in some sense, be themselves. I thought about Sam while I was reading that and found him again. And found he'd had a whole life since we last knew each other. And of course, Sam, Light Meter, Stonehenge, Emily Carr, and the Vancouver Biennale. I think, yeah, Sam lived up to his potential and is having a good time. Remember Sam? Yeah, funny guy, but a whole life. And that's kind of it. Now, just about the last image. The most remarkable piece of architectural criticism we know of is the Tower of Babel. You make a building to aspire to everything, and God comes along and says, I'm going to fuck with your language. You're done. I think there's a kind of lesson in that. Not a great lesson, but a kind of telling lesson. That sometimes you just, it's just going to happen. That you can corrupt it with the language. Confronted by something that you find remarkable, that everyone else may have not find remarkable or have overlooked or something else, and you respond to it, I think that response, you have to answer to it. You have to go to that in some day. No matter what it is, to say, I'll paint a picture, I'll write a poem, whatever. For me, for the next little while, I have 3 or 4 things I really need to do. One of them is, in some sense, find a way of telling the world how amazing this is without the scavenger hunt. Scavenger hunt is fun, but maybe a way of enjoying your day there. Hunt down Bizet, look up Chopin. I can always tell people where Chopin is. You know where Chopin is? Down the hill. Oh, how do we get there? Around. But I think the proposition is that the most authentic thing to be able to do is, in some sense, to imagine that you do not suppress that response, that you actually step into it and understand that that response may cost you a lot in time or effort, but that it's actually valid, that it's a motivator. So I've gone way over. And in conclusion, I can only say thank you for indulging me. Thank you for making me part of this institution for so long. Thank you for letting me learn so much here.